The night. Everything changed July 16, 1941. Sidi Barrani, Egypt. 2:47 a.m. Lieutenant David Stirling crouched in the suffocating darkness of the C-47 transport plane, feeling it buck and shudder through a sandstorm at 500 feet. In 17 minutes, he and 62 men of his newly formed Commando unit would jump into the Mediterranean night over German-held territory. Their mission: destroy enemy aircraft at 5-axis airfields simultaneously, crippling Rommel's air superiority in a single devastating strike. But that wasn't the impossible choice facing Stirling at that moment. The pilot had just informed him that the winds were gusting at 45 miles per hour, nearly triple the safe limit for a parachute drop. Stirling could see the cotton straps of the static lines vibrating with turbulence. He'd watched men die in training jumps under these exact conditions. The silk canopies would drift them miles off target into minefields and German patrols. Some wouldn't even make it to the ground. The violent winds would slam them into the rocky desert at lethal speeds. Abort, and the entire concept he'd spent 6 months fighting to prove would die. The generals who called his ideas reckless fantasy would be vindicated. The British Army would continue throwing away lives in futile frontal assaults. North Africa, and perhaps the entire war, would remain locked in Rommel's favor. Jump, and he'd likely kill most of his men before they fired a single shot. Every man in that plane was a volunteer who'd survived the most brutal selection process the British military had ever devised. They'd followed Stirling because he promised them they could change the war. Now he had to choose: their lives tonight, or potentially tens of thousands of lives over the years to come. This was the most consequential decision in the history of special operations warfare, though nobody knew it yet. By the end of this story, you'll understand why what happened in the next 60 seconds would transform how every elite military unit in the world operates, and why this moment has been somehow forgotten by everyone except the warriors who inherited Stirling's legacy. But we can't just jump straight to that plane bucking through the sandstorm. Without understanding the context, you can't grasp why Stirling's gamble mattered so desperately, or why, if he failed, the consequences would cascade far beyond a single disastrous raid. Let's go back to June 1940, 13 months before that fateful jump. France had fallen. Not slowly, not after heroic resistance, but in 6 weeks of stunning defeat. The British Expeditionary Force had barely escaped annihilation at Dunkirk, leaving behind nearly all its heavy equipment. Britain now stood alone against Nazi Germany, which controlled continental Europe from the Arctic Circle to the Spanish border. The Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler. America remained neutral, its isolationist sentiment keeping it out of what most Americans viewed as Europe's war. Winston Churchill, who'd just become Prime Minister, faced a strategic nightmare. Britain couldn't possibly invade continental Europe, not for years. The British Army had perhaps 10 properly equipped divisions. Germany had over 150. A cross-channel invasion would be suicide. But Britain couldn't just defend its home islands either. The British Empire, still the world's largest, depended on controlling the Mediterranean Sea and the Suez Canal. Lose the Mediterranean, and Britain lost access to Middle Eastern oil, Indian troops, and the direct route to the Far East. The empire would be cut in half. Britain would lose the resources to continue the war. Italy's entry into the conflict on June 10, 1940, made this nightmare immediate. Mussolini had 400,000 troops in Libya and Italian East Africa. Britain had perhaps 36,000 troops in Egypt defending the Suez Canal and the Mediterranean's eastern approaches. The Italians outnumbered them more than 10 to 1. Initially, this mismatch didn't seem catastrophic. The British forces in Egypt, though outnumbered, were better led and equipped. Between December 1940 and February 1941, British and Commonwealth forces under General Archibald Wavell executed Operation Compass, a brilliant offensive that destroyed 10 Italian divisions, advanced 500 miles, captured 130,000 prisoners and seized Cyrenaica, the eastern portion of Libya. It looked like the entire Italian position in North Africa might collapse. Then, in February 1941, everything changed. Hitler couldn't allow Italy to be completely defeated. It would expose southern Europe to British invasion. He dispatched the Afrika Korps to Libya, 2 German divisions, 25,000 men, under the command of Generalleutnant Erwin Rommel. Rommel was 50 years old, a decorated veteran of World War I, and had just led a panzer division to stunning success in France. He was aggressive, tactically brilliant, and, crucially, willing to ignore orders from his superiors when he saw an opportunity. Within weeks of arriving, he'd launched an offensive that wasn't supposed to happen for months. By April 1941, he'd recaptured all the territory Italy had lost and pushed the British back to the Egyptian border. For the next year and a half, the North African campaign settled into a grinding stalemate. Neither side had enough strength for a decisive victory. Rommel would advance, overextending his supply lines, then have to retreat when British reinforcements arrived. The British would counterattack, gain ground, then have to pull back divisions to defend other theaters: Greece, Crete, Syria. The front line surged back and forth across hundreds of miles of desert like a deadly tide. But this wasn't a stalemate Britain could afford. Every month, the strategic situation deteriorated. In June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Hitler's Eastern armies were now engaged in a titanic struggle that would eventually decide the war. If Germany defeated the Soviet Union, it would control resources, oil, grain, minerals, that would make it nearly invincible. Britain desperately needed Germany to fail in Russia. That meant Britain couldn't afford to keep hundreds of thousands of troops tied down in North Africa. Those soldiers were needed in Burma, defending against Japan. They were needed in the Atlantic, protecting convoys. Most of all, they were needed being trained and equipped for the eventual invasion of Europe that would be necessary to win the war. Yet Rommel's Afrika Korps, never more than 3 divisions strong, was tying down 5 times its number of British and Commonwealth troops. The exchange rate was catastrophic for Britain. Worse, Rommel was winning the tactical battle despite having fewer men. His secret weapon wasn't tanks or artillery, it was air power. The Luftwaffe had approximately 400 aircraft in North Africa by mid-1941. Messerschmitt fighters, Stuka dive bombers, and, most importantly, Junkers Ju-52 transport planes. These aircraft gave Rommel eyes on the battlefield. They attacked British supply convoys. They provided close air support during battles. And every night they returned to their bases, refueled, rearmed, and prepared to do it all again. British forces had aircraft too, but they were spread across multiple theaters. The RAF simply couldn't achieve air superiority. Every British offensive stalled when Luftwaffe fighters strafed advancing columns. Every defensive position became untenable when Stukas screamed down. The mathematics were brutal. Britain was shipping in supplies, equipment, and reinforcements, everything from tanks to tinned beef around Africa, a 12,000-mile voyage that took 6 weeks. Germany shipped supplies 300 miles across the Mediterranean from Italy in 2 days. Britain had more resources globally, but Germany was exploiting interior lines to concentrate force exactly where it mattered. By summer 1941, British commanders faced a terrible realization. They couldn't win the air battle through conventional means. They didn't have enough aircraft, and even if they did, the Luftwaffe was operating from prepared bases with extensive anti-aircraft defenses. British bombing raids on Axis airfields were costly and ineffective. The Germans would scatter their planes at the first warning of attack, then return after the bombers left. The standard military response would be to request more resources, more fighters, more bombers, more anti-aircraft guns, more everything. But there weren't more resources to be had. The Battle of the Atlantic was consuming fighters for convoy protection. The defense of Britain required extensive anti-aircraft defenses. The Soviet Union, now Britain's reluctant ally, was screaming for supplies and equipment. This was the context that terrified everyone who understood the strategic picture. Britain was trapped in a war of attrition in North Africa, bleeding resources it desperately needed elsewhere, unable to achieve the air superiority necessary for a breakthrough, and, most critically, with no conventional solution in sight. The front line by July 1941 had stabilized near Tobruk, a port city on Libya's coast that British and Australian forces had successfully defended during Rommel's advance. Both armies were exhausted, regrouping for the next round. Intelligence estimates suggested Rommel was preparing another offensive for autumn. When it came, British commanders weren't confident they could stop it. General Wavell, who'd been replaced as Middle East commander after the reverses, had written privately, "Without air superiority, we cannot hold. With it, we cannot lose. Everything depends on destroying the Luftwaffe's capability in this theater." But how? British bombers couldn't effectively target the dispersed German aircraft. Commando raids on airfields had been tried and failed. The bases were too well defended, the commandos couldn't carry enough explosives, and the Germans had learned to expect attacks. What was needed was a capability that didn't exist. A way to strike multiple airfields simultaneously, deep behind enemy lines, with enough explosive power to destroy dozens of aircraft, without the warning that bombing raids provided. It was impossible. Everyone agreed it was impossible, and that's exactly what terrified everyone who could see the slow-motion disaster unfolding. The knowledge that something impossible had to be accomplished, or Britain would lose the one theater where it was actually fighting Germany on land. There was one man who thought differently about the problem, not because he was smarter than the generals, but because he'd spent the previous months being forced to think about warfare in completely new ways. His name was David Stirling, and on the surface, he seemed like the last person who would revolutionize military doctrine. Born on November 15, 1915, David Archibald Stirling was the son of a Scottish brigadier general. His family owned Keir House in Perthshire, a sprawling estate that had been in the Stirling family since the 15th century. His childhood was one of extraordinary privilege. Private schools, shooting parties, fox hunting, and the expectation that he would follow a traditional path into either the military or diplomatic service. Instead, young David became known primarily for being spectacularly unsuccessful at meeting those expectations. At Ampleforth College, he showed little aptitude for academics and even less interest in applying himself. His school reports were litanies of disappointed comments about potential not realized and troubling lack of focus. When he moved to Trinity College, Cambridge, he lasted barely a year before the university suggested he might be happier elsewhere. The genteel phrasing for being kicked out. His family, exasperated but still hopeful, secured him a position at an art school in Paris. Surely their wayward son could find direction in painting. Stirling treated Paris as an extended vacation, perfected his French, and discovered he had no particular talent for art. By his early 20s, Stirling had become that recognizable type, the charming, well-connected upper-class drifter who seemed constitutionally incapable of committing to anything. He'd attempted to become a professional gambler. He'd started and abandoned plans to climb Mount Everest, not as part of an expedition, but rather by himself, without bothering to learn mountaineering first. He'd tried his hand at various business schemes, all of which collapsed due to his inability to handle administrative details. His brothers had respectable military careers. His sisters married well. David was the family embarrassment, living on a small allowance, charming his way through London society and showing no signs of settling down. Then, in July 1939, with war clearly approaching, something clicked. Perhaps it was the recognition that this war would be different, that Britain's survival was genuinely at stake. Perhaps it was shame at the thought of his family serving while he remained a playboy. Perhaps it was simply that, at 23, he'd grown bored with aimlessness. Whatever the reason, Stirling enlisted in the Scots Guards as a private soldier. He could have secured a commission easily. His family's connections guaranteed it. Instead, he started at the bottom, marching through basic training alongside working-class recruits. His commanding officers noted with surprise that the aristocratic drifter proved to be an excellent soldier, physically fit, quick to learn, surprisingly disciplined when he chose to apply himself. Within months, he'd been offered officer training. By June 1940, as France fell, 2nd Lieutenant Stirling was with a Guards regiment preparing for the defense of Britain. Then came the event that would change his trajectory completely. In June 1940, Churchill ordered the creation of Commando units, small, highly trained forces that could raid German-occupied Europe. The idea was to maintain offensive pressure even while Britain lacked the strength for conventional operations. Churchill wanted these forces to set Europe ablaze with raids, sabotage, and harassment. Stirling volunteered immediately. The Commandos offered exactly what his restless personality craved: action, autonomy, unconventional operations. More importantly, they valued initiative over rigid adherence to procedure. In the traditional army, Stirling's creative thinking and impatience with bureaucracy were liabilities. In the Commandos, they could be assets. By March 1941, he'd been accepted into No. 8 Commando, later reorganized as Lay Force, which was being sent to the Middle East. The unit was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Laycock, a capable officer who would later become Chief of Combined Operations. Lay Force comprised about 2,000 men, organized into several subunits. Stirling arrived in Egypt expecting immediate action. Instead, he found himself trapped in the same frustrating stalemate affecting everyone else. Lay Force launched several raids against the North African coast during spring 1941. Every operation followed the same pattern. Troops would load onto naval vessels, sail toward a target, usually an Axis port or coastal installation, conduct the raid, then escape by sea. In theory, this was classic Commando doctrine. In practice, it was a disaster. The naval vessels made noise approaching the coast. German radar sometimes detected them. Even when surprise was achieved, the Commandos could only carry limited explosives, whatever men could physically haul from the boats to the target. If the raid took longer than planned, the naval vessels had to leave or risk being caught at sea after dawn by Luftwaffe attacks. Stirling participated in several of these raids. He watched good men die accomplishing very little. The raid on Bardia in April 1941 captured a few prisoners but achieved no significant damage. The raid on Crete in May to support the island's defense saw Commandos landed, immediately engaged by German forces and forced to disperse. Many were captured. By June 1941, Middle East Command was questioning the entire Commando concept for North Africa. The raids weren't worth the resources. Worse, they were diverting naval vessels from more important tasks. Lay Force was scheduled to be disbanded, its men distributed to conventional infantry battalions. Stirling was appalled. He'd seen what the Commandos could do. They were excellent soldiers, superbly motivated, capable of extraordinary feats. The problem wasn't the men, it was the doctrine. In late June 1941, Stirling volunteered for a training exercise, a nighttime parachute jump to practice insertion methods. He'd never jumped before. The standard British approach to parachute training at the time was primitive, essentially learn on the job. On his first jump, Stirling's parachute caught on the tailplane of the aircraft. The silk partially tore. He hit the ground at excessive speed. He woke up in Scottish Military Hospital in Cairo with a crushed vertebra, temporary paralysis in his legs, and doctors telling him he'd be lucky to walk again, let alone serve in combat. For 2 months, Stirling lay in that hospital bed. His legs gradually recovered sensation, then function. The vertebra slowly healed. And during those 2 months of forced immobility, David Stirling thought harder about warfare than he'd ever thought about anything in his life. He was looking at the problem from an angle nobody else had considered. Naval commandos failed because ships were noisy and detectable. Conventional bombing raids failed because aircraft were tracked by radar and defended against by fighters and flak. Large-scale commando raids failed because the enemy could mass forces quickly to counter them. But what if you flipped the entire concept? What if, instead of large raids on heavily defended targets, you conducted small raids on lightly defended targets? What if instead of approaching by sea or air, both detectable, you approached overland through the desert? What if, instead of trying to destroy infrastructure that could be quickly repaired, you destroyed aircraft, the actual source of Rommel's tactical advantage? Stirling started calculating numbers in his head. The Africa Corps had approximately 400 aircraft spread across roughly 20 airfields. Most of those aircraft spent their nights parked in neat rows on desert airstrips, minimally guarded. The Germans and Italians didn't expect ground attacks deep behind their lines. The desert was considered impassable for raiders. A four-man team could destroy a dozen parked aircraft with time bombs. Even accounting for losses and failures, 10 four-man teams hitting different airfields simultaneously could destroy 100-plus aircraft in a single night. That was 25% of Rommel's air force, eliminated in hours, without a single British aircraft exposed to anti-aircraft fire. The more Stirling thought about it, the more convinced he became. This wasn't just possible, it was the solution everyone was looking for. There were obviously enormous obstacles. You needed men who could navigate hundreds of miles through enemy-held desert. You needed a way to get them to the target area. You needed reliable explosives. You needed perfect intelligence about airfield locations and security. You needed to coordinate multiple simultaneous raids without radio communication, which could be detected. You needed to extract the raiders afterward. Each obstacle was significant. Together, they seemed insurmountable. But Stirling had learned something crucial about himself during those months drifting through life before the war. He was spectacularly good at ignoring conventional wisdom when he'd decided something could be done. His failed mountaineering attempt? He'd been right that you didn't need to be an expert climber to attempt Everest. He'd just underestimated the scale of preparation required. His gambling career? He'd been correct that odds could be calculated and exploited. He just lacked the discipline to stick to a system. This time, though, he had discipline. The war had given him focus, and lying in that hospital bed, unable to walk, with his commando unit being disbanded and the war in North Africa stalemated, David Stirling concluded that small-scale airfield raids had to be attempted. He also concluded, with characteristic arrogance tempered by his recent string of watching proper procedures fail, that nobody would approve this plan through official channels. The idea was too radical. It violated established doctrine. It would be rejected by every staff officer who reviewed it. So Stirling made a decision that would define his career. He would bypass the chain of command entirely. By August 1941, Stirling could walk again. Barely. He was still officially recovering from his injury. But he'd written out a proposal for what he was calling L Detachment Special Air Service Brigade. The name was deliberate deception. There was no Special Air Service Brigade. The name was designed to make German intelligence think Britain had a new airborne unit. His proposal outlined the concept, the tactics, the organization, and, critically, the minimal resources required. Rather than submit this through normal channels, where it would die in some major's inbox, Stirling decided to approach General Claude Auchinleck directly. Auchinleck had just replaced Wavell as Commander-in-Chief Middle East. If Stirling could get 5 minutes with him, he might be able to sell the concept. The problem: second lieutenants don't get meetings with commanders-in-chief. The British Army's hierarchy was rigid. There were proper procedures. Stirling had approximately zero chance of getting through Auchinleck's staff to present his revolutionary idea. So, on a scorching August morning, still walking with a cane, Stirling simply limped through the front gate of Middle East headquarters in Cairo and started opening doors until he found someone senior enough to listen. The story of what happened next has become legendary in SAS history. Stirling was stopped by guards, evaded them, was chased through corridors, finally stumbled into the office of General Neil Ritchie, Deputy Chief of Staff. Ritchie, having a disheveled, technically trespassing junior officer interrupt his morning, was about to have Stirling thrown out when something made him pause. Perhaps it was Stirling's absolute conviction. Perhaps it was the desperate situation in North Africa making even radical ideas worth hearing. Perhaps Ritchie simply recognized that anyone crazy enough to break into headquarters might be crazy enough to have an idea worth considering. Ritchie read Stirling's proposal, then he walked it upstairs to Auchinleck. Auchinleck read it. He asked sharp questions. Stirling answered them. The meeting lasted 20 minutes. At the end, Auchinleck approved the formation of L Detachment Special Air Service Brigade. Stirling would receive authority to recruit 60 men from the remnants of Lay Force and other commando units. He would receive equipment, though not priority for supplies. He would get one chance to prove the concept worked. One chance. If the first operation failed, L Detachment would be disbanded. Stirling's military career would effectively be over. He'd be remembered as the reckless lieutenant who got good men killed with an impossible scheme. If it succeeded, though, Britain might finally have a weapon that could change the war in North Africa. By September 1941, David Stirling had concluded that his mission, creating a new form of warfare, must be accomplished. The question was no longer whether it could be done, but how to do it before his one chance evaporated. Most commanders thought the concept was impossible, and they had excellent reasons. Start with the most basic problem: navigation. Stirling proposed inserting small teams hundreds of miles behind enemy lines in the western desert. This wasn't European countryside with roads, villages, and landmarks. The Libyan desert was a featureless expanse of sand, rock, and scrub extending 200 miles from the Nile to Tunisia. Daytime temperatures exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit. At night, they dropped to near freezing. There was no water except at scattered oases. There were no roads except the coastal highway. How exactly would four-man teams navigate to precise target locations without getting hopelessly lost? The British Army's standard navigation training assumed roads and maps. In the desert, magnetic compasses could be thrown off by iron-rich rock formations. Maps were often inaccurate. The Italian maps of Libya, which British forces used, sometimes had errors of dozens of miles. Even if teams could navigate to their targets, how would they recognize the airfields? At night, from ground level, one stretch of desert looked identical to another. There were no lights, no signs. The teams would need to arrive at exactly the right spot, in darkness, after traveling potentially 300 miles through enemy territory. Then there was the insertion problem. Stirling initially proposed parachute insertion, which made sense. It was the only way to get men deep behind enemy lines quickly. But Britain's parachute training was rudimentary. Men received perhaps 3 training jumps before being considered qualified. Equipment often malfunctioned. The RAF had limited experience with nighttime drops over unmarked zones. And there was a cruelly ironic problem. Stirling himself had been crippled on a training jump. If the man creating this new unit had been nearly killed by the insertion method he was proposing, what did that say about the concept's viability? The explosives problem was equally daunting. To destroy aircraft effectively, raiders needed time bombs, devices that would allow them to place charges, withdraw from the airfield, and be miles away when the explosives detonated. British time delay devices in 1941 were unreliable. They used acid-based triggers that could fail in the desert heat or cold. Some had failure rates exceeding 30%. Each four-man team would need to carry perhaps 50 pounds of explosives, plus time pencils, plus weapons, plus ammunition, plus water, at least a gallon per man per day, plus emergency rations, plus navigation equipment. The total load would exceed 100 pounds per man. They'd need to cross potentially miles of open ground while carrying this weight, place charges on dozens of aircraft, then escape on foot or by vehicle. Security presented another layer of impossibility. How would teams coordinate to hit multiple targets simultaneously without radio communication? German and Italian signals intelligence was sophisticated. Radio transmissions could be intercepted, direction finding could locate transmitters. But without radios, how would teams know if other teams had succeeded or failed? How would they coordinate extraction? And extraction was perhaps the most insurmountable problem of all. After destroying the aircraft, teams had to get back across hundreds of miles of enemy territory to British lines. They couldn't be extracted by aircraft. Landing planes behind enemy lines was suicidal. They couldn't walk, it would take weeks, and they'd die of thirst or be captured. Stirling proposed using the Long-Range Desert Group, LRDG, for extraction. The LRDG was a unit of New Zealand and British soldiers who'd been conducting reconnaissance patrols deep into the desert using modified trucks. They were experts at desert navigation and survival. But using the LRDG meant perfect coordination. Raiders and LRDG patrols had to meet at precise locations at precise times without radio communication after operations that might go wrong in dozens of unpredictable ways. If a team missed its rendezvous by even a few hours, the LRDG patrol would have to leave. They couldn't risk being caught by daylight. The team would be stranded. The intelligence requirements added yet another layer of impossibility. To hit airfields effectively, raiders needed to know exact locations, number and type of aircraft present, security arrangements, patrol patterns, ammunition dump locations, fuel depot positions. This intelligence had to be current. Germans moved aircraft between bases constantly. British intelligence in North Africa wasn't that good. Aerial reconnaissance could photograph bases but not determine security details. There were few agents behind German lines. Intelligence estimates were often days or weeks out of date. Then there was the enemy's capability. German and Italian forces weren't incompetent. They'd established defensive procedures. Airfields had guards, perimeter patrols, and quick reaction forces. After the first raid succeeded, if it succeeded, they'd dramatically increase security. Stirling's concept assumed multiple raids over months. With each raid, the enemy would adapt, making subsequent raids exponentially more difficult. And all of this assumed Stirling could recruit the right men. He needed soldiers who could navigate in the desert, handle explosives, operate behind enemy lines without support, endure extreme conditions, and, most critically, think independently. The British Army in 1941 emphasized following orders, not initiative. Finding 60 men with the right combination of skills and temperament would be extraordinarily difficult. Finally, there was the resource problem. Britain didn't have unlimited parachutes, explosives, vehicles, or supplies. Every resource allocated to L Detachment was a resource not available for conventional forces. If Stirling's raids failed to destroy significant numbers of aircraft, he'd be wasting resources the Army desperately needed elsewhere. When Stirling presented his concept to fellow officers, they pointed out all these obstacles. Some were polite. It's creative thinking, but I'm not sure it's practical. Others were blunt. This is a suicide mission. You'll get men killed for nothing. The most common response was, even if everything goes perfectly, even if you navigate perfectly, place the explosives perfectly, coordinate extraction perfectly, you might destroy a few dozen aircraft. The Germans will replace them within weeks. What's the point? This was the scaffolding of impossibility that Stirling faced. Navigation, insertion, explosives, coordination, extraction, intelligence, enemy adaptation, recruitment, resources, and, underneath all of it, the question of whether the entire effort would matter even if it succeeded. Most commanders would have concluded it was impossible. What they didn't understand was that Stirling had already accounted for most of these objections in his mind, not with perfect solutions, but with what he called good enough solutions. Navigation. He'd work with the LRDG, who were the best desert navigators in the world. They'd handle getting teams to the target area. The teams themselves only needed to navigate the final few miles. Insertion. He'd make the parachute training more rigorous. Most injuries happened because men didn't know how to land properly. Intensive training could reduce the casualty rate. Explosives. He'd work with the SOE, Special Operations Executive, to get better time pencils, and he'd train his men to be explosive experts themselves. If the devices failed, they'd improvise. Coordination? Simple. Set a specific date and time. All teams would strike simultaneously based on predetermined schedules. No radio communication necessary. Extraction. That was the brilliant part. The LRDG would position patrols at prearranged coordinates. After the raid, teams would navigate to those coordinates. If they missed the rendezvous, there would be multiple fallback points and dates. Intelligence? He'd build relationships with intelligence officers, incentivize them to prioritize his needs, and accept that information would be imperfect. His teams would adapt to what they found. Enemy adaptation? Yes. Security would increase. But there were 20 airfields. Hitting 3 or 4 simultaneously meant the enemy couldn't strengthen all of them equally. And each successful raid would force the Germans to divert resources to base security. Resources not available for frontline operations. Recruitment? He'd select men himself. No bureaucratic assignment process. He'd interview every candidate personally. Resources? He'd ask for the minimum necessary. 60 men, some parachutes, some explosives, access to the LRDG for transportation. The cost was trivial compared to conventional operations, and the final objection, that destroyed aircraft would be replaced, missed the entire point. Yes, Germany would send replacement aircraft, but that took time. For weeks after a successful raid, Rommel's air superiority would be reduced. During those weeks, British forces could launch offensives, move supplies, reposition troops, and if raids happened regularly, the Germans would be in a constant state of reduced capability. More subtly, regular successful raids would have psychological effects. German and Italian pilots would know their aircraft weren't safe even behind their own lines. Base commanders would be forced to increase security, diverting infantry from the front. German logistics would become more complicated as they dispersed aircraft to reduce vulnerability. Stirling wasn't promising to win the North African campaign single-handedly. He was promising to tilt the odds, to give conventional British forces the breathing room they needed. But he had to prove it would work, and he had one chance to do so. He was risking his reputation, his career, everything. If the first raid failed spectacularly, if his men were killed or captured without destroying significant numbers of aircraft, the concept would be discredited. Nobody would fund a second attempt. The British Army would conclude that unconventional approaches to the airfield problem didn't work. In October 1941, Stirling received approval for his first operation. Intelligence reported 5 Axis airfields in the Gazala-Timimi area, approximately 200 miles behind enemy lines. Aerial reconnaissance suggested roughly 150 aircraft were dispersed among these bases. A simultaneous strike by 5 teams could potentially destroy 50 or more aircraft, more than 10% of the Luftwaffe's North African strength. The raid was scheduled for November 16, 1941, timed to coincide with Operation Crusader, a major British offensive. If Stirling's teams could cripple Rommel's air power just as British tanks attacked, the offensive might achieve a breakthrough. This was an enormous gamble. Not just for Stirling personally, but for the strategic situation. If the raid failed and the teams were captured or killed, it would confirm the skeptics' view that unconventional approaches were wastes of resources. It might shut down all innovation in British special operations for years. But if it succeeded, if 62 men could destroy what would take hundreds of aircraft and dozens of missions to accomplish through conventional bombing, it would prove that a completely new form of warfare was possible. September and October 1941 became the most intensive period of David Stirling's life. He'd won approval for his concept, but approval meant nothing without execution. He had perhaps 8 weeks to recruit, train, equip, and prepare his unit for an operation that would determine not just his career, but potentially influence the entire course of the war. Recruitment came first. Stirling needed 60 men, and he knew exactly what characteristics he was looking for, not just physical fitness. Plenty of soldiers were fit, not just courage. Combat required courage from everyone. He needed something more specific. Men who could think independently, adapt to chaos, endure isolation, and maintain discipline without supervision. He started with the remnants of Lay Force, the Commando unit that had been disbanded after its unsuccessful raids. These men had already volunteered for hazardous duty, proven themselves in combat, and, critically, were available. Many were frustrated at being reassigned to conventional infantry battalions after training for special operations. Stirling's interviews were unconventional. He didn't care about parade ground perfection or proper military bearing. When a sergeant reported with gleaming boots and a crisp salute, Stirling would wave him into a chair and ask, "If you're behind enemy lines alone and your transport is destroyed, what do you do?" The answer he wanted wasn't follow protocol or contact headquarters. He wanted creative problem solving. One of his first recruits was John Jock Lewis, a Welsh Guards officer and Oxford graduate who'd been with Stirling in Lay Force. Lewis was brilliant, disciplined, and had been independently thinking about improved raid tactics. He'd even developed a prototype explosive device, a mixture of plastic explosive, thermite, and oil in a canvas bag. When placed on an aircraft's fuel tank and ignited, it would burn through the metal and ignite the aviation fuel, destroying the plane completely. Stirling immediately recognized Lewis's invention as solving one of his major problems. The SOE's time pencils were unreliable, but Lewis's Lewis bombs were simple, reliable, and devastatingly effective. Each bomb weighed only a pound, but could destroy an aircraft worth tens of thousands of pounds. A 4-man team could carry 50 bombs, enough to obliterate dozens of planes. Stirling made Lewis his second-in-command and training officer. Together, they developed the selection process and training regimen. The selection was deliberately brutal. Candidates who'd already survived commando training found themselves facing even more demanding standards. They marched through the desert carrying 80-pound packs in temperatures exceeding 110 degrees. They navigated by sun compass and dead reckoning across featureless terrain. They practiced assembling and disassembling weapons blindfolded, simulating nighttime conditions at a target. Critically, they learned to jump. The parachute training was where Stirling's own injury influenced doctrine profoundly. British parachute training at the time was almost criminally inadequate. A few jumps from a static platform, then operational jumps. Men were getting injured at appalling rates. Stirling and Lewis revolutionized the training. They analyzed every aspect of the jump. Exit from the aircraft, body position during descent, landing technique. They built training apparatus, essentially tall scaffolds that allowed men to practice landing from height. They drilled proper technique until it became instinctive. Feet together, knees bent, roll on impact. The injury rate dropped dramatically. Men who learned Stirling's methods could jump safely even in challenging conditions. This seems like a minor detail, but it was revolutionary. Stirling was systematically analyzing failure points and engineering solutions. This methodical approach to tactics would become one of L Detachment's defining characteristics. By late October, Stirling had his 62 men. They came from England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, South Africa, and Rhodesia. Some were aristocrats. Others were working class. What they shared was a willingness to attempt the impossible. The training culminated in full rehearsals. Stirling found an abandoned airfield in the Egyptian desert and used it as a practice target. Teams would be driven to a point 20 miles away, navigate to the airfield at night, place dummy bombs on wrecked aircraft, then withdraw to a rendezvous point. Initially, teams got lost, couldn't find the airfield, or took too long. Gradually, they improved. By early November, teams were consistently hitting their targets. While training progressed, Stirling dealt with logistics, the unglamorous but critical work that would determine success or failure. Explosives were the first priority. The SOE provided Lewis with plastic explosive, thermite, and materials to manufacture his bombs. Lewis and a small team worked for weeks, hand-making 400 bombs. Each was tested to ensure reliability. This was vital. A dud bomb was worse than no bomb at all because it would alert the enemy without causing damage. Time pencils were another concern. The acid-based delay devices were better than nothing, but Stirling wanted redundancy. Teams would carry multiple types of triggers, including simple mechanical timers and even manually lit fuses for backup. Navigation equipment was perhaps the most critical logistical element. Stirling obtained sun compasses, devices that used the sun's position to determine direction, far more reliable in the desert than magnetic compasses. He procured the best available maps, though he knew they'd be imperfect. Each team leader received training in celestial navigation as backup. The relationship with the long-range desert group required careful cultivation. The LRDG was independent, proud, and initially skeptical of Stirling's paratroopers. The LRDG men were desert navigation experts who'd spent months proving themselves. Now this jumped-up lieutenant was asking them to risk their patrols extracting his commandos. Stirling handled this by showing respect and offering value. He invited LRDG officers to observe L Detachment's training. He made it clear his men would be prepared, professional, and wouldn't require babysitting. Gradually, the LRDG commanders agreed to cooperate. They'd position patrols at extraction points. If Stirling's teams didn't show up, the LRDG would leave, but they'd give the concept a fair chance. Intelligence preparation was the final piece. Stirling established relationships with intelligence officers at Middle East HQ. He learned which officers had the best sources, who could provide timely updates on airfield locations and aircraft strength. He pushed for aerial reconnaissance of his target airfields in the days before the operation. The intelligence picture that emerged was both encouraging and concerning. The 5 target airfields, at Gazala, Tamimi, and 3 other locations, did indeed hold significant numbers of aircraft. Aerial photographs showed approximately 150 planes total. Security appeared minimal. A few guard posts, no obvious fortifications, patrols that seemed routine rather than vigilant. But the intelligence was imperfect. Photographs couldn't reveal how many guards were present, whether there were minefields, or how quickly reaction forces could respond to an alarm. Stirling would be sending his teams into a partially understood environment. The mission plan came together gradually. 5 teams of 12 men each would jump from 5 aircraft. The drop zone would be a point approximately 50 miles south of the target airfields, far enough to be outside normal German patrol range, close enough that teams could march to their targets in one night. After landing, teams would bury their parachutes and spend the first day hidden in the desert, observing and finalizing their approach plans. On the second night, November 17th, 18th, all 5 teams would strike simultaneously. They'd place Lewis bombs on as many aircraft as possible, set the time pencils for a 2-hour delay, then withdraw rapidly. After the explosions, teams would navigate to rendezvous points where LRDG patrols would be waiting. The extraction plan included multiple rendezvous points over several days, providing flexibility if teams were delayed or separated. It was an elegant plan, depending on everything going right. Accurate parachute drops, successful navigation, undetected infiltration, effective bombing, clean escape, and precise rendezvous. Any single failure point could cascade into disaster. By early November, Stirling felt as prepared as possible. His men were trained, equipped, and ready. The LRDG was positioned. Intelligence was current. Weather reports suggested conditions would be acceptable. Not ideal, but acceptable. Then, on November 10th, everything nearly fell apart. A RAF officer reviewed the parachute insertion plan and noted that weather in mid-November could be unpredictable. The Mediterranean winter was beginning. There would be winds, possibly storms. He strongly recommended postponing the operation until spring, when weather would be more reliable. Stirling faced a choice. He could follow this professional advice, postpone the operation, and wait for better conditions. That would be the prudent decision. But Operation Crusader, the major British offensive, was scheduled to begin November 18th. The entire strategic rationale for his raid was to cripple German air power just as British armor attacked. Postponing meant missing this opportunity. It might mean the operation never happened at all. By spring, circumstances might have changed, or the concept might have lost its advocates. Stirling made his decision. The operation would proceed on schedule. He'd accept increased risk from weather rather than lose the strategic opportunity. On November 14th, 2 days before the scheduled jump, final intelligence arrived. Aerial reconnaissance confirmed all 5 target airfields were still active. Aircraft counts appeared consistent with earlier estimates. There were no obvious signs the Germans expected an attack. On November 15th, Stirling briefed his men one final time. He was characteristically direct. "This is dangerous. The parachute insertion will be risky. The raid itself will be risky. The extraction will be risky. But if we succeed, we'll prove that a handful of determined men can accomplish what entire bomber squadrons cannot. We'll save British lives. We'll shorten this war." He looked around the room at 62 faces. Every man was a volunteer. Every man knew the odds. Every man had decided this was worth attempting. "Tomorrow night," Stirling concluded, "we'll show them what's possible." On the evening of November the 16th, 1941, 5 Bristol-Bombay aircraft sat on the runway at Baghouz Airfield in Egypt. Their engines were warming up. Inside each aircraft, 12 men checked equipment one final time: parachutes, weapons, water bottles, compasses, explosives. David Stirling moved through the aircraft, speaking briefly with each man. There wasn't much to say. They'd trained for this moment. Either they'd succeed or they wouldn't. At 20:30 hours, as darkness fell over the desert, the first aircraft began its takeoff roll. The time had come. The flight to the drop zone should have taken approximately 90 minutes. The 5 Bombay aircraft flew in loose formation, maintaining radio silence, navigating by dead reckoning toward coordinates 50 miles south of the German airfields. Below them, the Mediterranean coast gave way to the empty expanse of the Libyan desert, invisible in the darkness except for occasional reflections of moonlight on rock formations. Inside the aircraft, the 12 men of Stirling's team sat in 2 rows along the fuselage. The noise was deafening. The Bombay's Bristol engines at full power created a roar that made conversation impossible. The smell was equally unpleasant: aviation fuel, oil, and the sweat of nervous men in a confined space. Stirling sat near the door, watching the RAF dispatcher who would signal when they reached the drop zone. He'd made dozens of practice jumps over the past 2 months. He'd trained his body to manage the fear, channel the adrenaline, execute the sequence automatically: stand, hook static line, check the man in front, shuffle to the door, launch into space. But this wasn't practice. Everything beyond this moment was real. At 2200 hours, Stirling felt the aircraft bank, slightly. They were approaching the drop zone. He looked down the line of men, gave a thumbs up. They returned it. Whatever else happened, they were ready. Then the aircraft entered the weather system. Nobody had predicted a full storm. The forecast called for possible winds and scattered clouds. What the 5 aircraft encountered was something far worse: a Mediterranean autumn storm that had swept inland from the coast, bringing howling winds and near zero visibility. The Bombay began bucking violently. Stirling felt his stomach drop as the aircraft hit an air pocket and plummeted 50 feet before the pilot recovered. Objects not tied down, equipment bags, water bottles, slid across the floor. The dispatcher grabbed a support strut to keep from falling. The wind speed at altitude was later estimated at 50 miles per hour. gusting higher. For context, British parachute operations were typically cancelled if wind speeds exceeded 15 miles per hour. At 50 miles per hour, silk parachutes became almost uncontrollable. Men would be blown miles off course. The horizontal forces during landing would be catastrophic. Stirling looked at his watch. 22:47. They should be approaching the drop zone. The RAF dispatcher was looking increasingly concerned, repeatedly checking his instruments, trying to calculate their position. But navigation in a storm, at night, over featureless desert, was nearly impossible. At 22:50, the dispatcher signaled 5 minutes to drop zone. Stirling had to make his decision. The aircraft commander couldn't force him to jump. The final authority rested with the mission leader. Stirling could abort. They could return to base, wait for better weather, try again another night. But Operation Crusader would begin in less than 48 hours. The strategic window would close. His men had trained for months. The LRDG patrols were positioned for extraction. Intelligence had identified the targets. Every element was aligned except the weather. More critically, if he aborted now, would he get another chance? Would General Auchinleck, who'd taken a risk approving this unproven concept, authorize a second attempt? Or would this be recorded as another failure of imagination, another example of special operations being impractical? Stirling thought about all the people who'd told him the concept was impossible. Aborting now would confirm their skepticism. It would validate the view that unconventional warfare was too risky, too unreliable. But jumping meant almost certainly condemning men to injury or death before they even reached the ground. The winds would scatter his teams across miles of desert. Some would hit rocks at lethal speeds. Others would be blown so far off course they'd never find the target. Still others would land in minefields or German patrol areas. The dispatcher signaled 2 minutes. This was the moment that defined leadership in special operations. Not the glory of success, but the loneliness of decisions made with imperfect information under extreme pressure. Stirling stood up. The static line snapped taut as he hooked it to the anchor cable. Behind him, 11 men stood and hooked their lines. In the 4 other aircraft, 60 more men were doing the same. The dispatcher held up one finger. 1 minute. Stirling shuffled to the door. The wind screamed past the opening. He could see nothing below except darkness. The aircraft was still bucking and shuddering. If he jumped now, he had no idea where he'd land. The dispatcher's hand came down. Go! Stirling launched himself into the storm. The slipstream caught him instantly, tumbling him end over end. He felt the static line snap taut, felt the deployment bag rip away, felt the canopy beginning to unfurl. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. The parachute seemed to catch on something. Then it opened with a jarring crack that sent pain shooting through his still-healing spine, but he was under canopy. He was alive. Then the wind hit him. Modern skydivers with steerable parachutes can compensate for wind. The silk parachutes of 1941 had almost no directional control. Stirling felt himself being blown backward, horizontal to the ground, at incredible speed. He couldn't see the ground. He couldn't see anything. The wind noise was so loud he couldn't hear his own breathing. He tried to remember his training. Feet together, knees bent, prepare to roll. But the horizontal speed was too great when he finally hit the ground. It wasn't the vertical landing he'd trained for. It was more like being tackled by an invisible opponent at full speed. He hit rocky ground at what must have been 30 miles per hour. His legs buckled, his shoulders slammed into rock. The parachute, still inflated, dragged him backward across the desert floor. He fought to collapse the canopy, finally managed to spill the air, lay gasping in darkness. He'd survived. He'd accomplished the first successful combat parachute insertion behind enemy lines in British military history. He was also completely lost, possibly injured, and had no idea where any of his men were. Stirling lay still for several minutes, letting his body recover from the shock. He performed a mental inventory. Spine hurt but functional, shoulder bruised but not dislocated, legs working. His equipment pack had torn loose during the landing, but he could see it about 20 yards away, still attached by its safety line. He retrieved the pack, opened it, and pulled out his compass. The sun was gone. It was full night now, but he had a rough sense of direction from his landing orientation. If the aircraft had been on course, he should be somewhere south of the target airfields, probably between 40 and 60 miles, depending on how far the wind had blown him. The first task was to find his team. In training, scattered jumpers would regroup at the drop zone, but in this wind, his 11 men could be scattered across 20 square miles. In darkness, in enemy territory, shouting was impossible. There might be German patrols within hearing distance. Stirling decided to wait until first light, when he could see. He buried his parachute. The white silk was immediately recognizable from aerial observation, found a small depression in the rocky ground, and settled in to wait. Dawn came at approximately 06:30. As light spread across the desert, Stirling saw the full extent of the disaster. He was in rocky, broken terrain, not the flat sand he'd expected. There were no landmarks he recognized from aerial photographs, and when he stood up and scanned 360 degrees, he saw no other parachutists. Over the next 2 hours, Stirling searched the area, moving carefully to avoid being seen from above. He found one of his men, Lieutenant Ewan McGonigal, who'd landed half a mile away with a twisted ankle. Together, they searched further. By noon, they'd found 4 more men from their stick. That meant 6 men from their aircraft of 12 had either been killed in the landing, captured immediately, or blown so far off course they couldn't be found. Stirling made a difficult decision. He couldn't spend days searching for scattered men. That would compromise the mission and endanger everyone. He'd proceed with the 6 men he had, attempt to reach the target airfield, and complete the mission if possible. The problem was determining which target airfield they should aim for. In the storm, the navigation had been completely disrupted. Stirling's best guess, based on the aircraft's heading before the weather hit, was that they were somewhere south of Gazala Airfield. But he couldn't be certain. They marched north through the day, navigating by sun compass, moving carefully through wadis and rocky areas to avoid being spotted. They saw no Germans, which was both reassuring and concerning. It suggested they were far from normal patrol routes, meaning they'd been blown significantly off course. That night, November 17th, they continued north. According to the mission plan, this was the night when all 5 teams should be hitting their targets simultaneously. But Stirling's reduced team was still miles from any airfield, exhausted, and operating without any knowledge of whether the other teams had survived. At approximately 200 on November 18th, they spotted lights in the distance, a German convoy on the coastal road. This gave Stirling a critical navigation reference. They were approximately 15 miles south of the coast. The nearest airfield, Gazala, should be about 10 miles northeast of their position. They'd never reach it before dawn. And even if they did, 6 men couldn't effectively raid an airfield that was supposed to be hit by 12. Stirling faced another terrible choice. They could try to reach Gazala, knowing they'd arrive exhausted and undermanned. Or they could navigate to the primary extraction point and hope the LRDG patrol would be there. But if they extracted without completing the mission, the entire operation would be a failure. 62 men had jumped into that storm. If not a single team reached its target, L detachment would be finished. Stirling decided to push for the extraction point. They'd missed their window for the raid. Attempting it now would be suicide. Better to survive, regroup, and learn from the failure. They marched southeast toward the coordinates where an LRDG patrol should be waiting. The extraction point was approximately 40 miles away. They'd have to cover it in darkness, hiding during daylight to avoid German patrols. For 2 days, Stirling's reduced team moved through enemy territory. They encountered no Germans. The desert south of the coastal road was apparently too empty to patrol regularly. They rationed their water carefully, supplementing it with minimal rations. They navigated by sun during the day, stars at night, checking and rechecking their position against the crude maps. On November 20th, at approximately 1600 hours, they reached the primary extraction coordinates. There was nothing there. No LRDG patrol, no vehicles, no sign anyone had ever been at this location. Stirling felt the first real edge of panic. If the LRDG hadn't come, his team would have to walk 200 miles back to British lines across enemy territory. They didn't have enough water. They didn't have enough supplies. Some would die. Then McGonagall, who'd been searching the area, shouted. He'd found tire tracks and a message cairn, a small pile of rocks that, when disturbed, revealed a note underneath. The note, in encoded form, indicated the LRDG patrol had been there the previous day. They'd wait at the secondary extraction point, 10 miles east, for 2 more days. Stirling's team force marched to the secondary location, arriving after dark. This time, they found the LRDG patrol, 3 Chevrolet trucks, 8 New Zealand soldiers, and water. The LRDG commander, Captain David Lloyd Owen, had grim news. Only one other L detachment team had made the extraction, Stirling's team of 6 and another team of 4, 10 men total out of 62. The storm had been even worse than Stirling experienced. Some men had been killed on landing, others had been captured immediately. Several aircraft had dropped their teams miles off course in the wrong direction. Of the 5 target airfields, not one had been successfully attacked. Operation Longcloth, the first mission of L Detachment, SAS Brigade, had been a complete and catastrophic failure. The ride back to British lines took 36 hours. Stirling sat in the back of a LRDG truck, watching the desert pass, doing calculations in his head. 10 survivors out of 62 men deployed. That was an 84% casualty rate. No aircraft destroyed, no targets damaged, not a single objective achieved. By any conventional military metric, this was the kind of disaster that ended careers. Courts-martial had been convened for less. Officers had been cashiered for operations with far better results. The LRDG men were professional enough not to say anything, but Stirling could read their body language. They'd risked their patrols extracting survivors of a failed operation. They'd been skeptical of paratroopers from the beginning, and this disaster confirmed their skepticism. David Lloyd Owen did pull Stirling aside during a rest stop. "What happened up there?" he asked quietly. Stirling explained the storm, the scattered drops, the impossible navigation, the decision to abort when it became clear the mission was compromised. Lloyd Owen nodded. "The weather was bad. We heard it on the coast. Anyone jumping into that—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to, but Lloyd Owen also said something Stirling would remember. "Your men who made the extraction, they navigated perfectly. Under terrible conditions, they found their way to a coordinate in the middle of nowhere. That's impressive." It was a small comfort, but it was something. The concept of small teams operating independently behind enemy lines was sound. The navigation training had worked. The LRDG coordination had worked. The problem wasn't the doctrine, it was the insertion method. When Stirling arrived back at base on November 22nd, he went immediately to write his after-action report. This was the most important document he'd ever compose. It would determine whether L Detachment continued to exist. He could have tried to obscure the failure, emphasize the weather as an unforeseeable act of God, argue that the concept deserved another chance under better conditions. That would have been the safe approach. Instead, Stirling wrote with brutal honesty. He detailed every mistake, every misjudgment, every point where the operation fell apart. He acknowledged that continuing the jump despite the storm was his decision, and that this decision had led directly to the casualties. But then, he did something critical. He separated the concept from the execution. The concept, small teams raiding airfields, remained sound. The intelligence had been good, the target selection was correct, the explosives worked, The navigation training was effective. The LRDG extraction functioned perfectly. The failure point was the parachute insertion. Specifically, the combination of nighttime drops, storm weather, and inability to abort once airborne created unacceptable risk. Stirling proposed an alternative. What if L detachment didn't jump at all? What if the LRDG transported teams directly to target areas? The LRDG already patrolled deep behind enemy lines. Their trucks could navigate the desert in conditions that would ground aircraft. They could position teams within striking distance of targets. Teams could raid on foot. Then the LRDG could extract them. This would eliminate the parachute risk entirely. It would also allow for larger teams. Trucks could carry more men and equipment than aircraft. Operations could be postponed if intelligence changed or conditions were unfavorable. The downside was speed. LRDG insertions took days instead of hours. Teams couldn't strike as far behind enemy lines as quickly, but if the alternative was losing most of your men before they reached the target, speed seemed like an acceptable sacrifice. Stirling submitted his report on November 23rd. He expected to be summoned, reprimanded, possibly relieved of command. L detachment might be disbanded, its remaining men distributed to conventional units. What he didn't expect was General Auchinleck's response. Auchinleck called Stirling to headquarters on November 25th. Stirling presented himself, prepared for the worst. Auchinleck had read the report. He looked at Stirling and said, 52 men. That's the cost of this operation. 52 men killed or captured. Stirling didn't flinch. Yes, sir. In exchange for 0 aircraft destroyed, 0 strategic advantage gained. Yes, sir. You understand that by conventional standards, this operation was an unmitigated disaster. I do, sir. Auchinleck paused, then said something Stirling hadn't anticipated. I've read your proposal for using LRDG transport. It's sensible. I'm approving one more operation. If that fails, L detachment will be disbanded, but you'll have one more chance. Stirling was stunned. He'd expected to be finished. Instead, Auchinleck was giving him another opportunity. Why? Auchinleck later explained his reasoning in correspondence. The operational failure was obvious, but Stirling's analysis and adaptation impressed him. Most officers would have blamed the weather, made excuses, or doubled down on failed approaches. Stirling had systematically identified the problem and proposed a solution. More importantly, the strategic situation hadn't changed. Britain still desperately needed a way to attack Axis airfields. Conventional bombing wasn't working. The Commando raids that had been tried before L detachment were even less effective. If there was any chance Stirling's concept could work, it was worth trying. And there was another factor. Operation Crusader, the major offensive, was in progress. British armor had attacked on November 18th, the same day Stirling's raid was supposed to happen. The offensive was grinding forward, but it wasn't achieving the breakthrough commanders hoped for. Rommel's air power was still functioning, still attacking British supply lines, still providing reconnaissance. If Stirling could cripple that air power, even temporarily, it might tip the scales. Auchinleck gave Stirling until mid-December. One more raid. Success or disbandment. Stirling walked out of headquarters and immediately went to find David Lloyd Owen and the LRDG commanders. He needed to sell them on a partnership. The LRDG officers were initially skeptical. Their mission was reconnaissance, not combat operations. They'd spent months building their reputation as ghost navigators, able to traverse the deep desert, gather intelligence, and return undetected. Carrying commandos on raids would make them more visible, increase their risk, potentially compromise their primary mission. But Stirling made a compelling argument. The LRDG's trucks traveled empty in one direction. They'd ferry supplies south, return north empty. Why not carry raiders north? The LRDG could drop teams within striking distance of targets, continue their own reconnaissance, then extract the raiders days later. The genius of this proposal was that it created a symbiotic relationship. The LRDG got access to L Detachment's explosives and weapons for their own protection. L Detachment got the LRDG's navigation expertise and desert mobility. Neither group would be subordinate to the other, they'd be partners. Lloyd Owen took the proposal to his commander, Ralph Bagnold. Bagnold considered it and agreed to a trial. The LRDG would transport one L Detachment team on a raid in early December. If it worked, they'd expand the partnership. Stirling now had to select his target and his team carefully. He couldn't afford another failure. He studied intelligence reports, looking for the perfect target. It needed to be significant enough that success would matter strategically. It needed to be accessible, within range of LRDG transport. It needed to have vulnerabilities. The Germans would have increased security after hearing about his first operation attempt, even though it had failed. He found two airfields that fit his criteria: Sirte and Agadabia, approximately 400 miles behind enemy lines. Intelligence reported approximately 40 aircraft at these locations combined, including Junkers, Ju-87 Stukas, and Messerschmitt fighters. More importantly, these airfields were relatively isolated, far from major German bases, lightly guarded, not expecting ground attack. The plan came together quickly. Two teams. Stirling would lead one team of 5 men targeting Sirte. Lieutenant Blair, Paddy Mayne, an Irish rugby international who'd survived the November disaster, would lead a second team of 5 targeting Agadabia, 20 miles away. The LRDG would transport both teams, drop them 10 miles from their respective targets, then extract them 3 days later at prearranged coordinates. The raids would be simple. Infiltrate at night, place Lewis bombs on as many aircraft as possible, withdraw before the explosives detonated, navigate to the extraction point. No parachutes, no complicated coordination across multiple teams. Just 2 small groups of professional soldiers, properly transported, hitting significant targets. The operation was scheduled for the night of December 14th to 15th, 1941. Stirling had 4 weeks to prepare. Those 4 weeks were critical. Stirling and Mayne drilled their teams relentlessly. They practiced moving silently at night. They rehearsed the bomb placement sequence. Each man would carry multiple Lewis bombs. Teams would spread out across an airfield. Each man would plant bombs on multiple aircraft. Time pencils would be set for 2-hour delays. They also practiced the withdrawal. After placing the bombs, teams couldn't run. That would be suspicious if observed. They had to walk calmly away from the airfield, as if they belonged there, until they were far enough away to move fast. Jock Loos improved his bomb design based on feedback from the surviving raiders. The new version was more reliable, easier to attach to aircraft, harder to defuse if discovered. On December 8th, Stirling's 2 teams loaded into LRDG trucks at Cairo and began the long journey west into enemy territory. The ride took 6 days. The LRDG navigators plotted courses through the deep desert, south of all German patrol routes, navigating by sun compass during the day and stars at night. They traveled slowly to conserve fuel and avoid detection. They saw no enemy aircraft, no ground patrols. The desert was so vast and empty that 2 forces could be within miles of each other and never make contact. On December 14th, just after dawn, the LRDG patrol stopped approximately 10 miles south of Sirte airfield and 15 miles south of Agadabia. Stirling's team and Mayne's team dismounted, checked their equipment, synchronized watches, and confirmed extraction coordinates. David Lloyd Owen, commanding the LRDG patrol, shook hands with both team leaders. 3 days, he said. We'll be here. Don't be late. Stirling's team set out immediately. They had 1 day to cover 10 miles, find a hide position within sight of the airfield, observe the target during daylight, then conduct the raid after dark. The approach was nerve-wracking. Every time they crossed a rise, Stirling expected to see a German patrol, but the desert remained empty. By mid-afternoon, they had found a position in a wadi with a clear view of Sirte airfield, about 2 miles distant. They spent the afternoon observing through binoculars. Stirling counted 21 aircraft, Stukas, Messerschmitts, and several transports. He noted the security arrangements. A few guards visible, no obvious perimeter patrols, no searchlights active during daylight. It appeared the Germans considered the base secure. They were 400 miles from British lines, in the middle of nowhere. As sunset approached, Stirling finalized the plan. They'd approach after full dark, approximately 2,200 hours. They'd infiltrate in 2 pairs and 1 singleton, spreading across the airfield. Each man would place bombs on as many aircraft as possible. Time pencils set for 200 hours, giving them 4 hours to complete the work and withdraw. At 21 Rundfokov, they moved out. The final approach to Sirte airfield took 45 minutes. Stirling led his 5 men in single file, moving through the darkness with the controlled precision of months of training. They could see the airfield clearly. The aircraft were silhouettes against the starlit sky, arranged in rough rows on the packed earth. There were no perimeter fences, no obvious sentries. The Germans had positioned their aircraft 400 miles from any British ground forces. They considered this base safe. At 22:30 hours, Stirling signaled the split. His team divided into their pre-assigned sections. Each man knew his role. Move to assigned aircraft, attach Lewis bombs to fuel tanks or wing routes, set time pencils, move to next aircraft, repeat until all bombs were placed. Stirling moved toward the nearest Stuka. Up close, the aircraft seemed massive. The distinctive inverted gull wing, the fixed landing gear, the cockpit canopy reflecting starlight. This was a dive bomber that had killed British soldiers, destroyed British vehicles, terrorized British supply convoys. In approximately 3 hours, it would be a burning wreck. He reached up, placed the first Lewis bomb against the wing root near the fuel tank, pressed it firmly so the adhesive held, inserted the time pencil, crimped it to start the chemical delay. The entire process took less than 30 seconds. He moved to the next aircraft. For 20 minutes, Stirling moved systematically through his section of the airfield, placing bombs. He lost count, 6 aircraft, maybe 7. He was utterly focused, operating on trained instinct. Approach, place bomb, move on. His breathing was controlled. His hands weren't shaking. This was what months of preparation felt like when it finally mattered. Then he heard voices. 2 German guards were walking along the flight line, approximately 50 yards away, talking casually. Stirling froze, still crouched beside a Messerschmitt fighter. If they walked toward him, they'd see him in seconds. The guards stopped, lit cigarettes. They were standing there, chatting, directly in the path Stirling needed to take to his next target. He had 2 choices: wait them out, potentially running out of time to place all his bombs, or risk moving past them. Stirling chose to wait. This entire operation depended on remaining undetected until the explosives detonated. Getting caught now would compromise everything. The guards finished their cigarettes, what felt like an eternity but was probably 5 minutes. Then they moved on, continuing their patrol away from Stirling's position. Stirling resumed placing bombs. He'd lost some time, but he still had perhaps 10 bombs left. He worked faster, accepting slightly more risk, checking over his shoulder constantly for more guards. At 23:20 hours, he reached his last bomb. He placed it, set the time pencil, and began moving toward the withdrawal point at the edge of the airfield. As he walked calmly across the open ground, moving like someone who belonged there, not running, not skulking, he saw his 4 men emerging from different sections of the airfield. They'd all completed their assignments. They regrouped at the pre-arranged point half a mile from the airfield and immediately began the hike back to the extraction coordinates. They moved quickly now, no longer worried about noise discipline. Distance was more important than silence. At 200 hours, while Stirling's team was approximately 5 miles from the airfield, the time pencils reached 0. The first explosion was visible as a flash of light on the horizon, followed seconds later by the sound, a deep crump that rolled across the desert. Then another explosion. then several in quick succession, then a massive secondary detonation as an ammunition dump or fuel storage caught fire. Stirling's team stopped and turned. From their position, they could see the airfield burning. Flames were clearly visible, massive plumes of smoke rising into the night sky, illuminated from below by continuing explosions. They'd done it. They'd actually done it. They walked through the night and all the next day, navigating toward the extraction point. On December 17th, exactly on schedule, they found the LRDG patrol waiting. David Lloyd Owen's first question: "Did you get them?" Stirling, exhausted, dehydrated, but grinning: 21. We hit 21 aircraft." Lloyd Owen's response was more emotional than his usual professional demeanor. "Paddy's team got 18 at Ajdabiya. 39 aircraft destroyed in one night." Jesus Christ. 39 aircraft. To put this in context, the RAF had launched multiple bombing raids on Axis airfields throughout 1941, losing dozens of bombers and crew, destroying perhaps 50 aircraft total across all raids combined. Stirling's two tiny teams, 10 men total, had destroyed nearly as many aircraft in a single night without losing anyone. The ride back to Cairo took 6 days. By the time they arrived, intelligence had confirmed the damage through aerial reconnaissance. The photographs were unambiguous: burned-out hulks, destroyed aircraft, damage that would take weeks to repair. More importantly, German signals intelligence, intercepted and decoded by British cryptographers, showed panic. German commanders were demanding explanations. How had British forces penetrated 400 miles behind the front line? Where had they come from? How many raiders were there? Were more raids coming? The psychological impact was immediate. The Luftwaffe began dispersing aircraft, increasing guards, establishing defensive perimeters around previously undefended bases. All of these measures diverted resources from frontline operations. When Stirling reported to General Auchinleck on December 24, 1941, the conversation was brief. Auchinleck: 39 aircraft. I've read the after-action reports. This is remarkable. Stirling: It proves the concept, sir. Auchinleck: It does. I'm authorizing expansion of L detachment. You'll get more men, more equipment, priority for supplies. I want regular raids. Keep hitting them. That conversation, lasting perhaps 10 minutes, changed the course of special operations warfare. By January 1942, L detachment had expanded to over 100 men. By March, they'd conducted 8 more raids, destroying over 150 additional aircraft. By mid-1942, the SAS, Stirling finally dropped the L detachment designation, had destroyed more enemy aircraft than the RAF in North Africa. The impact on Rommel's operations was significant. His air superiority, the key advantage that had allowed him to dominate the battlefield, was degraded. British offensives faced less aerial harassment. Supply convoys moved more freely. The strategic stalemate began tilting in Britain's favor, but the true significance went beyond simple arithmetic of aircraft destroyed versus aircraft replaced. By January 1942, David Stirling's unit had stopped being an experimental concept and become an established capability. The success at Sirte and Ajdabiya had proven that small teams could operate deep behind enemy lines, destroy significant targets, and return safely. But Stirling understood that one success didn't guarantee institutional acceptance. He needed to build on the momentum, expand the capability, and, critically, systematize the doctrine so it could be replicated. The expansion of L detachment through early 1942 was both rapid and careful. Stirling was now authorized to recruit up to 390 men, but he maintained his rigorous selection standards. Every recruit was personally interviewed. Every man underwent the same brutal training regimen: desert navigation, explosives handling, weapons proficiency, parachute qualification. They still trained for airborne insertion even though they were primarily using LRDG transport, and, most importantly, the psychological conditioning to operate independently. Stirling codified the training into what would become the template for special operations selection worldwide. The program emphasized physical endurance pushed beyond normal limits. Men marched for days through the desert with minimal water, simulating the conditions they'd face if an operation went wrong. This wasn't sadism. It was necessary preparation. Raiders who panicked when things went badly would get themselves and their teammates killed. Technical excellence. Every man became an expert in explosives, demolitions, weapons, and navigation. There were no specialists. If the team's demolitions expert was killed, someone else needed to complete the mission. Independent judgment. Training scenarios deliberately created situations with no clear solution. Men had to decide, abort and preserve the team, or continue with increased risk. There were no correct answers, only reasoned decisions based on weighing risks against mission importance. Psychological screening. Stirling developed an informal but effective method of identifying men who could handle the isolation and stress of operations. He'd watch how recruits reacted to setbacks, how they treated teammates, whether they could maintain discipline without supervision. Men who needed constant direction or validation were rejected, no matter how physically capable. This training philosophy, selecting for character and adaptability rather than just physical prowess, was revolutionary. Most military training in 1942 emphasized following orders and maintaining cohesion. Stirling was deliberately creating soldiers who would violate orders if they believed the situation demanded it. By March 1942, Stirling had organized his expanded force into 4 operational squadrons, each capable of conducting independent raids. This organizational structure allowed multiple simultaneous operations across different areas of the North African front. The raids continued throughout spring 1942 with devastating effect. The pattern was consistent. Intelligence would identify an airfield or supply dump. LRDG would transport a team into position. The team would raid at night. LRDG would extract them days later. The Germans never adapted effectively because each raid happened at a different location using slightly different tactics. Some operations became legendary within the SAS. Operation Squatter, March 1942. Paddy Mayne led a raid on Berka Satellite Airfield near Benghazi. His team of 4 men infiltrated the base and destroyed 27 aircraft. When they ran out of bombs, Mayne reportedly tore instrument panels out of cockpits with his bare hands. The raid was so successful that Rommel himself visited the base the next day to inspect the damage, and German records show he ordered aircraft dispersal patterns changed across the entire theater. Operation Bigamy, June 1942. Multiple teams hit 4 airfields simultaneously across a 200-mile front. Total destroyed 43 aircraft. The coordination required was extraordinary. Teams had to strike at precisely the same time without radio communication, using only synchronized watches and careful planning. The Benghazi Harbor Raid, September 1942, Stirling personally led a team that penetrated Benghazi Harbor and attached limpet mines to several ships. This wasn't an airfield raid, but it demonstrated the SAS's expanding capabilities. They could strike maritime targets, infrastructure, communication facilities, any high-value asset behind enemy lines. By mid-1942, the SAS had destroyed over 250 Axis aircraft through ground raids. For comparison, the RAF in North Africa had destroyed approximately 300 aircraft through bombing raids during the same period, but the RAF had lost over 100 of its own aircraft in the process, along with trained aircrew who were irreplaceable. The SAS lost approximately 20 men killed or captured across all operations. The cost-effectiveness was staggering. A single Hawker Hurricane fighter cost £6,000 and required a trained pilot. The SAS team cost the equipment they carried, perhaps £500 total, and destroyed aircraft worth tens of thousands of pounds. But David Stirling understood that raw numbers weren't the most important impact. The strategic effects were more subtle and more significant. First, the SAS was forcing Rommel to divert resources to base security. Every airfield now needed reinforced guards, perimeter defenses, patrols. Infantry companies that should have been fighting at the front were instead guarding rear area installations. This was classic economy of force, a small friendly force tying down a much larger enemy force. Second, the psychological effect on Luftwaffe personnel was significant. Pilots who'd felt safe behind their own lines now knew they could be attacked at any time. Aircraft mechanics worked under the assumption their work might be destroyed before dawn. This created a persistent, low-level stress that degraded effectiveness. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the SAS was demonstrating to British commanders that offensive operations were possible even during strategic defensive phases. When British armour was retreating in summer 1942 under Rommel's renewed offensive, the SAS continued raiding. This maintained morale and reinforced the message that Britain hadn't surrendered the initiative. The success attracted attention beyond North Africa. British commanders in other theatres began requesting similar capabilities. Churchill himself became an enthusiast, seeing in the SAS an example of the offensive spirit he'd been demanding since 1940. In September 1942, the Special Air Service was officially recognized as a regiment rather than a detachment. Stirling was promoted to lieutenant colonel. The unit's authorized strength increased to over 500 men. It received dedicated transport aircraft, priority for equipment, and, critically, direct access to high-level intelligence. But success also brought dangers, both tactical and strategic. Tactically, the Germans were learning. After losing hundreds of aircraft to SAS raids, they began implementing effective countermeasures. Airfields were dispersed. Instead of concentrating aircraft in neat rows, they'd spread them across multiple locations. Guard forces were increased and made more alert. Early warning systems were improved. Some bases received specialized anti-commando units. The SAS had to adapt. Raids required more men, more time, more complex planning. The casualty rate began increasing as German security became more effective. Operations that would have been straightforward in late 1941 became difficult by late 1942. Strategically, the SAS's very success created institutional jealousy and resistance. Conventional officers resented resources being diverted to private armies. There were complaints that the SAS was cherry-picking the best soldiers, leaving regular units with less capable men. Some senior officers argued the entire concept violated military principles of mass and concentration of force. David Stirling spent increasing amounts of time not conducting operations, but defending the SAS's existence to skeptical staff officers and rival commanders. In November 1942, the strategic situation shifted dramatically. The British Eighth Army, reinforced and rearmed, launched Operation Lightfoot at El Alamein. Simultaneously, American and British forces landed in Morocco and Algeria, Operation Torch, opening a second front in North Africa. Rommel was now caught between two Allied armies. The SAS's role shifted from strategic raiding to supporting the conventional offensive. Teams were tasked with reconnaissance, capturing key terrain ahead of advancing forces, and disrupting German retreat routes. Then, in January 1943, disaster struck. David Stirling was personally leading a reconnaissance operation deep behind German lines, scouting routes for the advancing Eighth Army. His small team was spotted by a German patrol. In the running firefight that followed, Stirling was captured. He'd spent months evading capture through cunning and audacity. This time, luck ran out. He was taken prisoner and would spend the remainder of the war in prisoner-of-war camps, including Colditz Castle, the supposedly escape-proof fortress. The Germans recognized who they'd captured. Stirling was interrogated extensively. German intelligence wanted to understand SAS tactics, organization, and future plans. Stirling, showing the same independence that had defined his career, told them nothing useful and made multiple escape attempts. The SAS continued operating under new commanders. Paddy Mayne took over L Detachment, while other officers led the expanded SAS squadrons. But something irreplaceable was lost when Stirling was captured. The combination of vision, audacity, and institutional credibility that he personally embodied. By May 1943, Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. The campaign that had consumed 3 years, cost hundreds of thousands of casualties, and tied down massive forces was over. The Allies controlled the Mediterranean's southern shore. The path to invading Italy, and eventually France, was open. The SAS's contribution to this victory was significant but difficult to quantify. They destroyed over 400 aircraft through ground raids, disrupted supply lines, tied down enemy forces, and maintained offensive pressure during Britain's darkest moments. More importantly, they'd proven that a new form of warfare was possible. After North Africa, the SAS expanded exponentially. By the end of World War II, it had grown to multiple regiments operating across Europe, Italy, France, the Balkans, and even the Far East. SAS squadrons parachuted into occupied France to support the D-Day invasion. They operated behind German lines in Italy and Greece. They conducted specialized missions that conventional forces couldn't accomplish. The tactics David Stirling developed in 1941-42 became the foundation for modern special operations doctrine. The emphasis on small teams, strategic targeting, operational independence, and rigorous selection spread throughout military organizations worldwide. After the war, the SAS was briefly disbanded. Britain was demobilizing, and private armies were seen as unnecessary in peacetime. But the Korean War, the Malayan Emergency, and other Cold War conflicts demonstrated the continued need for special operations forces. The SAS was reformed in 1952 and has operated continuously since. The influence extended far beyond Britain. When the U.S. Army established its own special operations forces in the 1950s and 1960s, they studied SAS tactics extensively. The U.S. Army Rangers, Delta Force, Navy SEALs, and other elite units trace doctrinal lineage to Stirling's innovations. The Australian SAS, New Zealand SAS, Rhodesian SAS, and numerous other Special Forces units explicitly modeled themselves on the British example. The core principles Stirling established remain fundamental to special operations. Selection based on character rather than just physical ability. Modern Special Forces selection processes, whether the U.S. Navy SEAL Bud-S, the British SAS selection course, or equivalents worldwide, emphasize psychological resilience, adaptability, and independent judgment. They're deliberately designed to identify the small percentage of soldiers who can operate effectively in chaos without supervision. Strategic effect through tactical actions. Special Operations Forces target objectives whose destruction or disruption produces effects disproportionate to the size of the force employed. This is exactly what Stirling did when he identified that destroying aircraft on the ground was more efficient than aerial combat. Economy of force. A small number of highly trained operators can tie down or neutralize a much larger enemy force. This principle, using minimal resources to achieve maximum strategic effect, runs through all modern special operations doctrine. Partnership with specialized support elements. The SAS's relationship with the LRDG established the model for how special operations forces work with specialized transport, intelligence, and support units. Modern special forces maintain similar relationships with aviation units, intelligence agencies, and logistics specialists. Continuous adaptation. The Germans adapted their defenses. The SAS adapted their tactics. This cycle of innovation and counter-innovation is built into modern special operations. Units maintain research and development cells, constantly studying new techniques, equipment, and approaches. Beyond military influence, Stirling's approach affected broader organizational thinking. Business management consultants in the late 20th century studied SAS tactics as examples of how small, empowered teams could outperform larger, rigid organizations. The emphasis on mission-type orders, giving teams clear objectives but freedom to determine methods, influenced management philosophy across industries. David Stirling himself, after being released from POW camps in 1945, never regained the same level of influence. He attempted various business ventures, most unsuccessful. He became involved in right-wing political causes in Africa during decolonization, some of which are now viewed as controversial at best. He remained connected to the SAS community and was revered by veterans, but his post-war life lacked the clarity and purpose of his wartime. Innovation. He died in 1990 at age 74. His funeral was attended by hundreds of SAS veterans, by senior military officers from multiple nations, and by members of special forces units worldwide who traced their heritage to his innovations. The memorial statue at SAS headquarters in Hereford shows Stirling in desert dress, looking toward the horizon. The inscription reads simply, "Founder of the SAS." It's an accurate but incomplete summary of his legacy. The true measure of Stirling's impact isn't just the unit he created, but how fundamentally he changed military thinking. Before 1941, small unit special operations were viewed as auxiliaries, useful for reconnaissance or sabotage, but not strategically significant. After Stirling demonstrated what properly trained, properly employed small teams could accomplish, special operations became a core military capability. Every major military power now maintains elite special operations forces. These units, despite differences in culture and organization, share common DNA traceable to Stirling's innovations: rigorous selection, intensive training, strategic focus, operational independence, and the fundamental belief that small numbers of exceptional individuals can accomplish what large conventional forces cannot. The aircraft Stirling's teams destroyed in 1941-42 were eventually replaced by the Axis. The immediate tactical victories faded, but the precedent, the proof of concept, the demonstration that this form of warfare was possible, that endured. In modern conflicts, from counter-terrorism operations to hostage rescues to strategic reconnaissance, special operations forces conduct missions directly descended from Stirling's desert raids. Small teams, operating far from support, targeting high-value objectives, achieving strategic effects through tactical actions. When Navy SEALs infiltrated Abbottabad to kill Osama bin Laden, they were executing the same fundamental concept Stirling pioneered: strategic targeting by small teams. When Delta Force operators conduct counter-terrorism missions, the selection process and training philosophy derive from SAS practices. When special forces worldwide insert behind enemy lines to conduct strategic reconnaissance or direct action, they're employing tactics refined from Stirling's innovations. So why has David Stirling's story and the revolutionary nature of what he accomplished faded from popular memory when it should be as famous as D-Day or the Battle of Britain? There are multiple rational reasons. First, the complexity of the context. Understanding why the SAS mattered requires grasping the strategic situation in North Africa. Rommel's campaign, the importance of air superiority, the resource constraints Britain faced, the limitations of conventional bombing. This is dense, multi-layered context that doesn't reduce to simple narratives. Most people know Churchill and Dunkirk. Far fewer understand the North African stalemate. Second, the nature of special operations itself. The SAS succeeded because it operated in shadows, without publicity, emphasizing deception and surprise. Unlike major battles with thousands of participants and clear outcomes, SAS operations were small, secret, and often known only through fragmentary intelligence reports. There are no dramatic photographs of burning Axis airfields. The raids happened at night, deep behind enemy lines, witnessed only by the raiders themselves and their victims. Third, the distributed impact. Stirling's innovations didn't win a single decisive battle. Instead, they contributed to the overall strategic picture across years. Historians can point to specific moments when D-Day succeeded or when the Battle of Britain was won. The SAS's contribution was cumulative, hundreds of aircraft destroyed across dozens of raids over 18 months. Cumulative effects are harder to dramatize than singular turning points. Fourth, Stirling himself was captured in 1943. He spent the last 2 years of the war in POW camps, unable to lead or advocate for his creation. By the time he was released, the war was over. Other commanders had received credit for victory, and Stirling was just another former officer trying to adjust to peacetime. He didn't write a best-selling memoir immediately after the war, didn't become a public figure, didn't leverage his achievements into lasting fame. Fifth, the SAS was briefly disbanded after the war. From 1945 to 1952, the regiment didn't officially exist. When it was reformed, it immediately became involved in classified counterinsurgency operations in Malaya. The modern SAS's culture of secrecy and operational security meant that its heritage, including Stirling's founding role, remained deliberately obscure. Sixth, post-war special operations became classified. During World War II, some publicity about Commando operations was permitted for morale purposes. After the war, as special operations forces became involved in Cold War conflicts, intelligence operations, and counter-terrorism, a culture of secrecy descended. The SAS didn't publicize its history because doing so might reveal techniques still in use. Seventh, the changing scale of warfare. In World War II, destroying 50 aircraft was strategically significant. By the Cold War era, nuclear weapons and intercontinental missiles had changed the calculus of strategic impact. Small unit operations seemed less momentous in comparison. Modern audiences accustomed to thinking about warfare in terms of massive forces, precision-guided munitions, and technology-driven combat find it hard to grasp how revolutionary it was for men to destroy aircraft by hand. Despite these factors, military historians have never forgotten Stirling's contributions. Professional military education at staff colleges worldwide includes case studies of early SAS operations. Special Forces selection courses teach recruits about Stirling as part of their unit's heritage. Academic. Studies of special operations doctrine consistently reference the North African raids as foundational examples. But academic recognition and popular memory are different. Stirling never captured public imagination the way other war heroes did, partly because his story doesn't fit conventional heroic narratives. He wasn't physically brave in the traditional sense. He didn't charge machine gun nests or fly fighters against overwhelming odds. His heroism was intellectual and organizational, recognizing that warfare could be approached differently, convincing skeptical superiors, building an organization, systematizing innovation. That's a harder story to tell, especially to audiences conditioned to expect physical courage and dramatic action. In the end, David Stirling's story deserves to be remembered not just as military history, but as a case study in how individuals can change institutions through a combination of vision, persistence, and performance. Remember that Stirling was a failed student, a drifter, someone who'd accomplished nothing significant in his first 23 years. Remember that his first operational mission was a catastrophic failure that killed or captured 52 of his men. Remember that he faced institutional resistance, skeptical superiors, and resource constraints. And remember that despite all of this, he transformed modern warfare. He did it by identifying a problem everyone else accepted as unsolvable, proposing a radical solution, accepting the risk of failure, learning from disasters, and persistently refining his approach until it worked. He did it by recognizing that doctrine wasn't fixed, that if conventional approaches weren't working, perhaps convention was wrong. The specific context was the North African desert in 1941-42, but the principle is universal. Sometimes, at critical moments, individual actions matter enormously. Institutions can be changed, doctrine can be revolutionized, impossible problems can have solutions that simply require thinking differently. Every modern Special Forces operator who conducts a mission behind enemy lines is executing variations of tactics Stirling pioneered. Every military that maintains elite small unit forces structured for strategic effect is implementing his organizational innovations. Every selection course that screens for character and adaptability rather than just physical prowess is following his example. That's the measure of revolutionary impact, not just what you accomplish personally, but how you change what others believe is possible. On July 16, 1941, Lieutenant David Stirling chose to jump into a storm rather than abort his mission, and that disastrous decision led to 52 casualties and 0 objectives achieved. But that failure also led to the insight that fundamentally changed how he approached the problem, which led to the partnership with the LRD, which led to the successful raids at Sirte and Agadabia, which led to the expansion of the SAS, which led to the destruction of hundreds of Axis aircraft, which led to the establishment of special operations as a permanent military capability used by every major military power today. If you work backward from modern Special Forces operations, from Navy SEAL Team 6 to British SAS counter-terrorism teams to elite units in dozens of countries, you eventually reach that night in the North African desert when a small team placed bombs on parked aircraft and walked away into the darkness. That was the proof of concept for everything that followed. David Stirling created the Special Air Service. But more fundamentally, he created the intellectual framework that legitimized and systematized strategic action by small elite teams. He proved that warfare didn't have to be about massing the largest forces at the decisive point, that sometimes a handful of determined, skilled individuals attacking the right target at the right time could achieve effects that entire armies couldn't match. This is our history, and it's worth remembering. Not to glorify war, Stirling's operations killed people, caused suffering, and occurred in the context of humanity's most destructive conflict. But to understand that innovation is possible even in the most rigid institutions, that conventional wisdom can be wrong, and that individuals willing to risk failure can change the world. The next time you read about Special Forces operations, whether rescuing hostages or gathering strategic intelligence or conducting precision strikes, remember where it started. In a British hospital bed where an injured officer spent months thinking about how to fight differently, then convinced skeptical generals to let him try, then led teams of volunteers into the desert to prove that the impossible was merely difficult. That's the legacy David Stirling left. The enduring knowledge that with the right people, the right preparation, and the willingness to attempt what others consider impossible, small teams can change history, and that's a lesson that transcends military operations. It applies to any situation where conventional approaches aren't working, where institutions resist innovation, where the impossible needs to become possible. Sometimes you have to jump into the storm, even knowing you might fail. Sometimes you have to accept catastrophic losses, learn from them, and try again with a better approach. Sometimes you have to convince skeptics by achieving results they didn't believe were possible. David Stirling did all of that. And in doing so, he gave us more than just the SAS. He gave us proof that individuals can change how entire institutions think, that small teams can accomplish what massive organizations cannot, and that the word impossible often means nothing more than we haven't figured out how yet. That's worth remembering. That's worth celebrating. That's the story of the Commando who invented modern special operations, not through a single heroic act, but through systematic innovation, persistent execution, and the willingness to learn from disaster and try again. This is our history, and it still matters.